Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Arman Vatyan, and I am PEMPAL Program and Internal Audit Community of Practice Leader at the World Bank Governance Global Practice. It's my pleasure to welcome you on our Internal Audit Community of Practice, or as we call it, IACOP, Smart Interactive Talk. The focus of this virtual event, that is Smart Interactive Talk, is on coronavirus impact on the internal audit activity, and with particular focus to the public sector. We have distinguished speakers with us today joining from different parts of the world, and I would like just to thank them for joining, as well as for all the participants who also joined us from various parts of the world. And now I would like just to pass the floor to Daniel Boyce, who is Governance Global Practice Manager for Europe and Central Asia East at the World Bank, who joined us at early morning from Washington, D.C. for welcoming remarks. Dan brings extensive knowledge and experience in governance reforms and has been managing Latin America and Caribbean region, and now Europe and Central Asia region. Dan, thank you for your support, and which is ongoing to our PEMPAL. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Arman. It's a pleasure for me to welcome all the participants from the 23 PEMPAL countries and also the many observers that may be connected in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and other regions to this IACOP Smart Interactive Talk. The World Bank and many other global institutions are working to support the government partners during this time, which we know is difficult and turbulent. In fact, when this coronavirus situation began, we started first in PEMPAL to see what we needed to cancel, what we needed to postpone, and many events were postponed. But then I asked the team whether they could consider having some virtual events. And so I'd like to really thank the participants and especially the speakers for joining us today, and also congratulate the organizing team for organizing this event so fast to prepare this discussion and have it all ready with this virtual connection that we're able to take advantage of today. Several countries have been contacting the World Bank since this situation started to inquire about the role that internal auditors can play in the public sector during the pandemic. A lot of the questions relate to twin goals, really, of, on the one hand, getting the audit work done, and at the same time, not having the auditors get in the way of the government's response to the pandemic. Some of the questions we've been asked, for example, whether this is really the right time to perform audits, given that some parts of the public sector are in like a wartime mentality, and they don't really want to be disturbed. So how can their clients who don't want to necessarily spend time with auditors right now be convinced to work closely with internal auditors? Another question is, how can the audit testing be done when the audit staff are confined at home, and probably your government staff as well? Or more broadly, how will the performance of the internal auditors be viewed if you're not able to carry out your annual audit plan? Similarly, on the annual risk assessment that you may have prepared, should it be adjusted to reflect this pandemic situation? And will you lose credibility since you probably didn't include the pandemic risk as part of that risk assessment? Perhaps most importantly, the question is really, how can internal auditors help to mitigate the risk of the emergency government spending, which may be done in large volumes in the next month or two, and probably without all the normal controls in order to have them done as fast as possible? And finally, as the funds are reallocated in your governments to emergency programs, some of you may be wondering whether audit resources may be reduced even at a time when the risks may have increased. Well, I'll leave it to the experts, and we have several today who can answer these questions. I want to just say again that it's great that the PEMPAL IACOP is tackling this important topic, providing this virtual platform for internal audit policymakers, from many countries to share their thoughts and practices at this critical time. I trust that with this consultation and knowledge sharing, you'll be able to make better use of the core function of internal audit now during the crisis and beyond, when we hope to get back to normal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for welcoming remarks, and thank you for very important questions you have shared. Those are really important, and I trust we will cover many of those today, and probably we need just some follow-up actions just to scrutinize those in more detail via our further activities. And now I would like just to pass the floor to Edith Nemeth, IACOP Executive Committee Chair and Internal Control Working Group Leader, the Central Harmonization Unit, the policy maker of internal audit and control in the Ministry of Finance of Hungary. Edith effectively chairs IACOP Executive Committee and helps to shape the value of our community. Edith, back to you.
Hello, everyone. On behalf of the IACOP Executive Committee, I would like to welcome you to this new platform, first of all, and our very first smart interactive talk in IACOP. I think this is a new beginning, a new format, but our dedication has not changed at all. I think it is even stronger than before. And we can say that we are a very strong community, and I hope that you are all safe and keep strong and take care of yourself, which is very important in the situation to be and keep in health. So I would like to address a bit about this special situation, which requires always special solutions. I think internal auditors also kind of first responders inside the organizations. So they need more work on risk assessment. They need to give more advice to the head of organization how to react to this situation. So I think it is a very actual and very interesting topic for today, and we are very eager to hear from all over the world, which we will have a lot of presentation now, from South Africa, from UK, from US. So I think it will be very interesting to hear how different areas react on this problem. So thank you very much, and I wish a fruitful conference for us.
Thanks, Edith, and thanks for your leadership and support in the preparation of this event. Now, let's move to our speakers, to our distinguished speakers, and we'll start with James Patterson. James is a former Chief Audit Executive at AstraZeneca, who has been actively involved in risk assurance mapping and agile auditing. So these are actually the topics which we are looking for. James has recently published a note which coronavirus business not as usual, and that applies to internal audit. James, you say that when being pragmatic and flexible to fight fires, now how to ensure we won't cut corners and that we will not regret in 6 to 12 months from now. Shall we follow 80-20% rule, or there are areas with no compromise? How to be insightful, proactive, and future-focused at the time of crisis? Please share your thoughts. The floor is yours, James.
So just very quickly, I'm a head of audit. I've got used to doing lots of things, thank you very much, by webinar, because normally I'm on a plane. So the good news has been not so much time on a plane recently. We've known about pandemics for some time, both known about them intellectually, seen them happen overseas. And one of the big questions, I think, for any risk management function, any internal audit function is, how did your organization assess this risk? I think there'll be enormous learning in the future about how did we think about this risk before it happened. And then certainly the first notification of this pandemic was in January, the end of December 2019. When did your organization, when did your government actually start thinking about making preparations? The risk management phrase is looking out for weak signals. So at what point did your organization see the weak signals, the warning sign of the tsunami that was coming, and start to take action? It seems like some countries saw these weak signals and really acted quickly, and other countries waited until it was too bad. Unfortunately, the country I'm in doesn't seem to be doing well on that. I'm based in the UK. So that's the first thing to say. And I'm just going to talk briefly about risk management. Most risk management frameworks, if you look at the framework on the left, have an impact framework and a likelihood, and then we multiply the impact by the likelihood. So one question for you is, what is your definition of low probability? How infrequent does something need to be a low probability? Some people were saying a pandemic is a 1 in 100 year event, such as Spanish flu. But in fact, we've had epidemics and regional health issues every 5 years. So there's important questions about that. And also, how was the impact rated? What I can show you on the second diagram is something that I've used with clients, and it's based on failure mode effect analysis. This is something used by NASA. How good is your organization? How good is your country at assessing high, very high, and dangerously high risks? I think what often happens is we have a number of high risks, but what we probably have learned now is to distinguish between a high or a very high risk and a dangerously high risk, such as a pandemic. So using this FMEA framework is something you may want to consider, or your risk management may want to consider. And then finally, in the 9/11 New York crisis in 2001, one of the commission report findings was there had been a failure of imagination to consider what might happen. How imaginative is the risk management processes that you deal with? The next thing, please. I think we'll all be looking in the future, once we're out of crisis management mode, into risk management processes. And a few things, next slide, please. A few things that I'd like to highlight. How good is your risk management process at thinking about about how quickly a risk will come? So that's the velocity of the risk. How good is your risk management process at looking at this detectability, seeing the weak signals? And then also what we're seeing is how one risk can connect to other risks. And you can see here with COVID, that one risk connects to economic and other issues. How good is your risk management process at thinking about those things? Two other things I would say. Risk management only really works when it's part of business as usual. So when you do an audit of risk management in the future, don't ask for the risk register, ask for the meeting minutes that discussed the risk issues. Secondly, I've written risk-based risk management, not just risk-based internal auditing. Do the risk management processes that you deal with analyze critical risks in a lot more detail than other risks? Very often we analyze those in not enough detail, as we've probably all discovered now. I'm just going to remind you about what the International Professional Practices Framework says. It says that internal audit should offer insight and be proactive and future focused. So it's critical, I think, when we do any work right now, to think about how do we coordinate with other people. This could be consultants, this could be other functions, so we don't simply do work that duplicates what other people are doing. If we're doing work perhaps on how we're dealing with a crisis, or whether the contingency plans are working the way we want them to, Can we really make sure that we don't just repeat what the organisations already know? One of my key messages to you all, I'm sure you do this, is only raise issues which are genuinely new and insightful. If you do want to repeat things, then make it clear that we already know that this is going wrong, and these are now the new insights that internal audit is going to offer. So has your internal audit team defined what it means to be insightful? And I've included on the right of that slide some examples of this. Next slide, please. So in terms of internal audit, and a number of you have said this already, one important good practice is to look at your internal audit plan again and to prioritise which audits are you doing that are relevant for the board, which audits are you doing that are relevant for executive management, which audits are perhaps mostly for local management. And certainly, as I hope you've seen in the paper that's been circulated, I would be encouraging you to defer all or parts of any audit that is not a top priority, and certainly to complete existing assignments as quickly as possible. I've mentioned here flash reporting or abbreviated reporting so that you don't spend the normal length of time finishing off an audit report. I also think it's going to be crucial to look at all open items at the moment, prioritise those. Which items from the past absolutely must be closed off, notwithstanding COVID, and which items can perhaps be deferred because COVID has really put the risk profile in a completely different picture. And then obviously, in terms of new risks and new projects, if you're going to do work in relation to what's going on, then you're going to need to do that in a lean and agile way, much, much quicker and more focused than you have done perhaps in the past. So there is a book on lean and agile auditing that I've written, but a few things that I would emphasise. When you're doing an assignment in the current environment, consider what is the exam question. The idea would be, what is the most critical one or two questions that you need to get an answer to, and to be much tougher on your audit team if they want to audit lots of other things as well. Always start your audits with what's known already. And another important role that you may have to have is to look at audits between departments, because perhaps the risks that are being faced happen between departments rather than within an individual department. And another thing, given that there are bound to be things that aren't going so well, is to really push when you start your audit, not at the end. If I found this issue, would you care? How big would this problem have to be before it would become a priority? Because all too often, if you highlight that there are issues, for example, with a potential fraud, or there are issues perhaps in relation to data, one of the questions will be, well, okay, some of the new funding schemes may have a fraud risk, but how much of a fraud risk are we prepared to take so that we can get money out to taxpayers and to businesses quickly? And so those issues about what is the real risk appetite, I think for many of you, when it comes to fraud prevention, probably one of the biggest risks you've got is a wide-scale systematic fraud or type of fraud rather than individual frauds in specific areas. In some sense, if your government has a fast scheme, it probably admits that there's going to be some evidence of that. When it comes to field work, it's going to be vitally important to get direct access to documents and data. Remote working has already been discussed. It's also going to be useful to try to use analytics, but probably with somebody who knows what they're doing. This is probably not a time to start experimenting with data analytics unless you've got somebody really good. And then one of my other key bits of advice, being lean and agile, is to discuss what you're finding, what you think the concerns are with the team and with the people that you're working with, and don't write the report unless you're clear what the report is going to say. This is not a time for auditors to spend 3 days writing a report and then for there to be several days rewriting and redrafting a report. So try to get the report done right first time. And obviously, asking your auditors to think really carefully about consequences that matter, particularly given everything else that's going on. You know, in the current environment, an issue that might be €100,000 may not be nearly as important as a €10 million issue. And you need your auditors to be able to see the difference between those. And certainly audit reports, I always say to people, any report more than 20 pages is definitely something you need to look at. But certainly audit reports of even 1 to 3 pages or 5 to 8 pages might be something that you should be looking at. And also it's worth thinking, given that everything is so fast moving, how long are you going to give people to fix things? And who is going to be accountable, particularly if the accountable person might change, if they became ill. So these are all things to be thinking about now, so you don't get arguments when you make recommendations that are, well, we need 2 years to fix that. You need to decide what issues need to be fixed in the next 1 to 3 months and what issues generally can be left. And another obvious point is, don't be afraid of feedback. Don't be afraid of negative feedback in this time. And if you are open to criticism, that will stop you being seen as an audit department that's slowing things down. You can't be seen as an audit department, as you know, in that light at the moment. Just a couple of other slides to show you. Obviously, there's only a limited amount of time. I thought I'd show you some examples, next slide, of innovative reporting. And I've got 4 diagrams to show you. One is an audit heat map, where the areas that you've audited, the controls that you've audited are to the right, and then the overall result is to the left. And if you haven't audited an area, that's in grey. So that's giving one message for an audit. The next example is a project dashboard, where we are looking at a project and we're highlighting, for example, in red, that there is a problem with resourcing and planning people's time, but we're only issuing a 1-page report about that project. To the right, we have process visualization. If you can use data analytics, perhaps with the IT department or the finance department, this could be a wonderful time to think about doing anti-fraud work by looking at the way processes are being followed and also where the strange exceptions to following the process seem to be. Process visualization allows you to easily see strange things in processes that are being done and then to target your audit efforts on those. That, I think, is going to be really important if you start thinking about anti-fraud activities over the next few months. And then finally, if there are projects, the idea of an assurance map where you show the different people who are working on the project and how much checking, how much work that they're doing, that can then reveal, as you can see in the first line of the project assurance work, we've got 2 people working on this in some detail, but it can also reveal areas where actually there isn't that much checking, there isn't that much assurance going on. Again, these are things to think about to try to get audits done quickly. Couple of other things from me. The next slide, please, is obviously there may be issues rather than auditing so that you give some advice. And one thing that I would emphasize is if you're giving lots of advice in the current environment, do you have a methodology? Do you have a framework for giving advice? this sounds like a very basic issue, but it's very often when I'm working with people, they don't actually have a methodology for doing this. Certainly, I would say, and I'm sure you do this, for any advice over a certain amount, you should be emphasizing the area that you're going to give advice in and your role. And I can't stress strongly enough at the moment the importance in any advisory work that you do that you state limitations on what you're doing. I've actually included an up-to-date example based on COVID of limitations on the advice that we're going to be giving as internal audit. This is important to protect yourself and also to make sure that if you're not providing the assurance or the advice in some area, well, then who is? Now, one of the big fears about advice, as you all know, is that you end up, I've only got a couple of more minutes to go, I know, is you feel that you give advice and then management may not act on it. And certainly one thing that I would say is who is keeping track in your audit team of all of the advice that you're giving and what priority that advice is. So I would be keeping a record of the priority 1, priority 2 advice being given by my audit function. And then what I would be doing is I would be clarifying, particularly for the high priority advice that we've been given, are management following our advice? Or are they deciding for whatever reason that they're not going to do it? And certainly I would be encouraging all of you that are doing advisory work to keep a list of the advice that you've given on key issues, and don't be afraid to escalate advice that you've given where management has decided not to do it, so at least that you can clarify that the risk has been accepted by management. Because what you don't want is to have been involved in something, gave some advice, that doesn't happen, and then a material issue transpires. For example, you give advice on anti-fraud activities, which finance or ministers decide not to take. It's very important that management own that risk and it doesn't come back on you as internal audit. The final benefit of having a record of all the advice that you've given is it will really help you when you do your planning for next year, what areas you should look at or what areas you need to be careful of in terms of auditing what you've already advised on. And then the final slide is, I think that at the moment, there are significant weaknesses that we found in governance, risk and compliance. I know COVID is exceptional, but we're supposed to prepare for crises and business continuity. So I think in the future, there will be a lot of lessons to be learned. There are tools such as the asymmetrical risk and the failure mode effect analysis. But one of the learnings, I think, is, are we applying those in our risk management processes? There are obviously the issues about planned assignments and new assignments and follow-up. And then also, I think there are important opportunities for us to rethink adding value, because I do think if you can get this right as an audit team at the moment, you may be able to reposition how your audit team is seen by senior management. You'll be able to work on stuff where you're not simply repeating what other people know, and they will say, wow, internal audit really made the difference there. So I think there's going to be a lot of internal audit functions that will really do well out of COVID. It's a horrible thing to say, but equally there will be a lot of internal audit functions that will lose ground. Their reputation will decline if they're not seen to be operating in a lean and agile and a proactive way. And hopefully, if you read my paper, and there's other stuff as well to look at on my website, I've got you thinking a few things to think about so that you maximize your reputation. Thank you very much, and hopefully I've kept to time.
Very much, James. Very insightful presentation, and the thoughts which made us to think that internal audit can make a difference, as you say, and can, or at the same time, it can lose grounds if we're not agile, proactive, and reflect on the tools you just indicated. I trust we will have more questions after the presentations. Let's now move to collectively explore different examples from countries on the actual impact of COVID on the role of internal audit. Let's start with from Manfred van Kesteren. Manfred is a manager bringing extensive experience in the internal audit, and he works in the Dutch Central Government Audit Service. He is also an international expert on internal audit and financial management and control. Jointly with Ruslana Rudnicka, who is recognized internal audit and control expert in Europe and Central Asia region, they represent the National Academy of Finance of the Netherlands. And the National Academy is our PEMPAL long-standing partner. So I'm very pleased to pass the floor to our colleagues, Manfred and then Ruslana. Manfred, the floor is yours.
Once again, thank you very much, Arman, and also the previous speakers for already the very insightful words. A lot of issues I will also touch in my short presentation, which I will do together with Ruslana Rudnicka. Very short introduction. I will focus first on, let's say, the Dutch situation in the public sector concerning how internal audit is responding to this COVID crisis. As some of you might know, in the Netherlands, the internal audit function within the public sector has a centralized character. So our internal audit function a few years ago merged into one organization, the Central Government Audit Service, which is part of the Ministry of Finance. So we have a total of around 600 to 700 auditors who are responsible for the internal audit function throughout the government. And of course, these auditors are also still, let's say, closely connected and located within the departments where they are working, but functionally, like I said, working for the Ministry of Finance. I see that my presentation is popping up, so to waste no more time, I think it is good to start. So again, I will highlight first the examples of the Netherlands. Where are we now, considering this crisis, this COVID crisis? How are we responding? After that, I will hand over to Ruslana, who will give some insight in how the Ukraine is currently dealing with the crisis, and we will end with a few takeaways from our presentation. Yes, thank you. COVID-19. First, a little bit of context. When I was preparing this presentation, it was in the beginning of April. As you can see, the amount of cases of COVID in the Netherlands generally was already quite high, 18,000 cases, 1,800 deaths. Today, as we speak, these numbers have doubled. So that shows how quickly this crisis still is emerging also in our countries, or in our country, the Netherlands. In terms of, let's say, responding of the government, you see more or less the same response as you see in a lot of countries. Restrictions on traveling, 1.5 meter social distancing, no organized events, at least till June 1, but that will probably be extended, etc. But we don't have, let's say, a total lockdown. Still, it is possible to, let's say, go around as long as you adhere to these fundamental rules which are described in the third bullet. An important issue, I will come to that later because that also relates to the role of internal audit, is that our Cabinet of Ministers issued an social economic support package, mainly for companies, small, medium-sized companies, entrepreneurs and the self-employed, which, for example, guarantees maximum 90% of the wage bill that will be covered for these companies, covering the loans to bridge the crisis and to loosen the fiscal deadlines. So that package is quite broad and substantial, and of course asks for also a role of internal audit, how we deal with that from an audit perspective. I will come to that in a minute. So this is a little bit about the context that we are talking about in the Netherlands. The impact on the public sector. What did the crisis mean for the public sector as a whole? Well, Already at the end of February, there were restrictions on business trips. Like one of the colleagues who was talking previously, I also tend to travel a lot on international projects. Well, that was quite quickly already at the end of February restricted, so to say. And starting from March 13, it was mandatory for all public servants to work from home, except exception was made for so-called critical functions. Together with that, or in conjunction with that, specific IT measures were enrolled. So you can imagine if the departments or the ministries and all the employees starting to work from home, you want to do that on a secure network. You want to ensure that your information security is up to par to deal with threats that might threaten the reliability of your network. Also increasing the bandwidth when everybody starts video conferencing and using the IT network extensively, that has implications for your bandwidth. So also there measures were taken to make sure that everybody could work well from home and still could reach the information that they need to reach. Restrictions on tools to use. As we all know, there are many tools for example, video conferencing or sharing information online. Very quickly, our, let's say, public sector made a decision in which tools we can use, but maybe more important, which tools we cannot use. Also, internal audit played a role in that decision-making process. I will come back to that. And so in our environment, it is only basically allowed to use Skype for Business or WebEx. Also, additional IT tools needed to be made available. Laptops, tokens to securely log into the system were made available throughout the public sector for people who needed them. But all in all, and this refers nicely, I think, to the previous presentation where the term failure of imagination captured my attention. When I look back now, let's say a couple of weeks, when you ask me, was the public sector really ready for this pandemic? My answer would be no. Of course, there were crisis scenarios on the shelf. They existed for all kinds of disruptions of the main business processes to ensure business continuity, etc. But not to this extent, not with this magnitude that was overseen. So that failure of imagination, what if a pandemic of this size would happen? What would be the real impact throughout the public sector and beyond? That was, a couple of months ago, unimaginable. A nice example of that is the health impact on employees who do the work in the public sector that was neglected and overseen. And so already now we can see what lessons we can draw in relation to crisis management and risk management. So currently, although it is getting better, the departments or the ministries in the Netherlands are more in a crisis management mode than in a risk management mode, I would say. So it is really responding on what is happening. But steps are being made and we learn on the go. Last bullet on this slide, every ministry installed a crisis management team in their, let's say, sector of responsibility. And those crisis management teams are, of course, in close contact with the national coordination team. We have a so-called outbreak management team who coordinates all the activities from the public sector regarding response to the pandemic. And of course, also key institutions like the health advisory body plays a role in that. So this is a little bit about the implications of the COVID crisis in the public sector. So now let's have a look at the impact on internal audit. First, a few general remarks. I consulted in the Netherlands, let's say, our methodological department, policy department, like what is currently, let's say, the state of affairs in internal audit? Are we also performing crisis management as internal audit in response to this crisis? Or are we doing well? Or are we responding well to what is happening around us? Well, in general, things are still relatively going concern in the Netherlands. The team of directors have daily meetings. The team of directors of the Central Government Audit Service have daily meetings on the impact of the work on internal audits, but also with external assurance providers like the Supreme Audit Institution. There is now, let's say, maybe even more than usual contact with them, with these external stakeholders and external assurance providers regarding the impact on our work and where we can help each other out. And so that is one thing. The contacts are there. Communication with our audit clients and the key client coordination functions of the Central Government Audit Service remain intact. Within our department as internal audit, we have so-called client coordination functions who usually maintain the one-on-one contact with our clients, with our departments, with the secretary generals, with the ministers, etc., director generals, to make sure that that we are on top of the business, that we know what is going on, and that we can respond in good cooperation on their questions. Well, those communication lines remain intact because we see that as vital for our business continuity as internal audit, to stay in touch with our key clients. So that is a vital issue, of course. At the moment, as we can foresee, we are still able to fulfill the annual audit plan. However, and I like the word agile, which was used by the previous speaker many times, we try to do that. We try to respond in an agile way to the crisis by, let's say, reallocating priorities in our annual audit plan related to what we can do at the moment, what are key priorities, what can we bring forward, and what can, let's say, be more like a long-term activity for now. And but for the moment, we foresee that we are able to still do quite an amount of work what we originally already planned. Audits continue by using the mandatory IT tools that we as internal audit department use anyway. We already rely quite heavily on IT tooling in the Netherlands. And now we even learn more how to use them in this crisis situation. For example, interviewing, we try to do via video conferencing. Of course, there are a lot of questions surrounding here, like reliability, security, information security, secure handling of sensitive information. Those are, of course, issues that we have to deal with audit by audit to see what is possible using these IT tools. Audit reports we sign digitally, of course, now. So they're not a so-called wet signature, but a digital signature. But that means the same. So these are also little responses that we or adjustments that we try to make during the crisis. And our existing audit management system, as audit department, we use Teammate, remains very helpful in ensuring that our, let's say, normal day-to-day audit filing and the audit trail remains according to the standards and according to what is required in audit filing and audit archiving. The role of internal audit towards our clients, as I already mentioned, the clients, the departments which we are working for. Internal audit, first of all, has a seat in these crisis management teams in the ministries. I told you earlier that every ministry has such a crisis team. As internal audit, we try to be proactive and to join those teams, not as a responsible actor, so to say, but as, let's say, a critical fly on the wall to be able to, in these crisis teams, also to give advice regarding risks that might be overseen. It can be in the IT area, it can be in the financial area or in the operational area. So this role of internal audit as a critical fly on the wall in the crisis team is one of the ways that we try to be, let's say, proactive and upfront of where it is happening. So internal audit has this consulting advising role during the development and implementation of the social economic support package. I mentioned that, this package to support small, medium enterprises, companies, etc. Also there we are trying to be, let's say, on top of the business and consulting at the front end, as we call it, of the business, and advising and consulting and making sure that, let's say, the obvious risks regarding this support package, think about fraud, already mentioned by the previous speaker, the fair distribution of these funds. We play a role in that, in shifting our attention towards that front end of the business. Heightened attention of data leaks, cybersecurity, also very important, of course. I already mentioned, when your client organizations all start to work from a distance, new risks emerge. And that's specifically when you rely a lot, and even more now, on IT, that has its implications. And internal audit tries to play a proactive role in that. Not only regarding the public sector itself, but also a nice example is that our government is now issuing a tender for a so-called Corona app. That is an application for civilians which tracks if you are nearby somebody who has been infected. There's a lot of discussion in our country regarding the rollout of that app. There are now 7, let's say, potential companies for the development of that app. But of course, our IT auditors are looking over the shoulder when these apps are developed, because you can imagine also there a lot of risks regarding privacy, security, etc. play a role. So our internal auditors are also directly involved in those responses of, let's say, our government towards the crisis. Special focus, of course, on the internal control environment. So basically the financial management and control internally in our departments. Also here, we try to catch that proactive front-end involvement and not to be, let's say, the last one on the bandwagon and only, let's say, respond when and look back when the crisis already has been diminished. Internally, we work with so-called audit alerts. So our audit community is kept up to date with latest developments and latest guidelines how to respond as audit function. And these audit alerts have been published nationally, but also internationally, for example, by our professional organization, the IIA, nationally by the National Accountancy Organization of the Netherlands and the National IT Audit Association of the Netherlands, which is also connected to ISACA. Those organizations issue so-called audit alerts, which we try to transform into, let's say, a policy specific for our audit departments. Audit committees, of course, we have them in the Netherlands, and we try to also keep them involved and online and informed in virtual WebEx meetings. I will try to speed up a little bit because I'm also looking at the clock. The role of internal audit internally. So I already mentioned that internally we also keep our people up to date. We have an internal central government audit service letter, which our team of directors pretty much daily updates our people, our 600-700 people, on, let's say, the latest developments. Something very different. We have a picture rubric on our intranet that you can still see your colleagues, how they are working from home. Colleagues are making blogs, so we try to also maintain a sort of let's keep in touch with each other environment internally in our internal audit department. Last but not least, also during this period, of course, our permanent education obligations still remain. So what we try to do is also make that easier for the people by offering free advanced online training courses for our employees, and we have connection with, let's say, well-respected training institutions who are willing to help us out also in this area. Can we go to the next slide, please? Already mentioned, new risks emerge in this crisis. It is uncertain how long this will last. Today we don't know when we will go back to, let's say, a normal modus operandi. The impact of the crisis is big. What will this mean for our work? What will it mean for our client organization? These are still questions that also for us are a little bit of a black hole, but we learn on the go, as I mentioned. We try to anticipate on these challenges by proactively have a seat at the table where it happens, where the decisions are made, and be that fly on the wall. Not the decision maker itself, not taking over the responsibility, but being the critical friend, so to say, and stay in close contact with our stakeholders internally and externally. Also, we try to revise our risk management strategies. We try to catch our role here. So like, what does this crisis mean? What can we learn from it in our, let's say, existing risk management strategies? And how can we advise our internal stakeholders on those issues? Last but not least, and then I will hand over to Ruslana, post-corona strategies are already being developed. Because you can imagine after this crisis, there will be a lot of learning points, and maybe it will never be the same again as it was before the crisis. What will be our role when this is all over, or when it is diminished, this crisis, in reviewing crisis response, business continuity, etc. These might be, let's say, also opportunities for internal audit in the future to put the spotlight on, because we learn now in the crisis, through crisis management, through responding on it, but also in the future that might have implications of how we will develop as a profession as a whole. So not only in the Netherlands, but worldwide. We will learn a lot from it, that is for sure.
Etc. But in terms of COVID, Ukraine first cases was identified somewhat later compared to the Netherlands, and it came sometime mid of March. And since then, actually, the government response started quite actively. And basically, just very briefly, not to stop too long for this general situation, again, compare with Dutch experience in Ukraine, the quite tough measure being introduced gradually, but from the 6th of April, I would say that was quite a tough lockdown, which means that there are no public transportation in between cities, even within cities, the public transportation is limited. And it relates to the stop of the small businesses related to the social connection, etc., etc. We expect to wear masks. We are not allowed to go without a mask, and it goes as far as we are not even allowed in Ukraine to walk in the park, in the forest, which, of course, a bit too much still. Of course, government also respond in terms of its financial and economical issues related to changes in the state budget, but this development released quite late, almost 1 week ago. In comparison to the Netherlands, in Ukraine, internal audit is decentralized, and this also influences the relation between the CHU, which is in the Ministry of Finance, and internal department, which actually mean that internal audit department, they are subordinated, of course, to the management, and they are following the rules and the legislation which is issued by the management or specific authorities. We have a connection with CHU, and CHU, of course, connect with internal audit department, but the status for today, actually, Ministry of Finance of Ukraine didn't issue any document, unfortunately, unfortunately no methodologies or guide which should or could help internal audit department and its development and work in this current situation. Instead, what they are mostly, the work is organized, it's more hands-on work through the telephone, answer the questions. And in this respect, a CEHU position is that internal audit department should follow the special regime and regulation which are issued by each authority. And depend of this regime and regulation, internal audit department work in this condition within specific ministries or specific authority. To feel a little bit how internal audit department actually working, we tried to send them a very short questionnaire, and basically we got quite a lot of answers. Almost 50% of their internal audit department responded this few questions, and the result of this response showed that what is happening in this moment, most of internal audit department is basically working on the distance type of work. And this distance type of work, of course, create a lot of consequences and to some extent problems and challenges for the department. And one of the issue and one of the challenge that they face and they report about is, of course, changes in the planning. In their annual plan, they can't fulfill their assignment. This is what they're concerned about. This is what they're worried about. And this is the issue they are asking CEHU how to deal with this. Another aspect that internal auditors report, of course, they feel a shortage of the instrument or methods they can use when they're doing this audit, so-called on distance, because for our block of country, most audit, what they are conducting in this case is basically what they can do. They can only work with a document. There's also kind of limitation in their access to the information. They can't also visit their organization in a lot of cases. And this is quite basic, but these are difficulties internal auditors in Ukraine experience at this moment. And of course, lack of knowledge on IT techniques and its use in practice in different stages of the internal audit is a challenge for auditors. But of course, we should not forget that internal auditors, in terms of Ukraine, I would say they are kind of beginner in a way. And when they face this different, it's influence their behavior, I would say that they are a little bit lost. This is how I could describe. In terms of the questionnaire we sent, we also got just few examples when internal auditors reported they got so-called ad hoc requests from management on specific audit to be conducted in relation to the situation, on the relation to the answer for the specific condition which they face for today. And this mostly these cases and audit being related to the procurement procedures. It's especially related to the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Social Affairs. But again, it's only a few cases when we see attention and need from the management and from their side to get involvement of internal auditors. In other cases, internal auditors mostly try to continue their job, but again on a distance way. Just very briefly, a few general conclusions in terms of Ukraine, and then the very last slide. So what I can say that basically level of development, government development, public sector development is strongly related to the reaction and response for the internal auditors and also risk and crisis that we face, all countries are faced for today. In this case, there are a little bit delay with the CEHU position and CEHU response also influence the situation and make internal auditors somewhat lost in this situation, and this will actually influence the quality of their work. In the same time, for internal auditors in Ukraine, especially, I don't want to talk for another countries, the issue of use of IT skills and knowledge and techniques became quite crucial in case of situation for today. And it's not only related to the performance of internal audit work, but internal audit work on a different stage of the process, because they also reported with a lot of difficulties they face for today. Nevertheless, it was quite interesting to read in terms of recommendation. In a lot of cases, internal auditors are really asking and require more training, more webinars, and more learning possibility where they can improve their knowledge, their skills. But this is something what we can learn, and probably we can take into account in terms of our reaction, if it's possible, community reaction or project reaction and individual reaction on a different level.
A lot has already been said. Proactivity is one of the key takeaways, front-end role of internal audit. Try to be on top of things in times of crisis, because at least in the Netherlands, we have the philosophy at the moment that is the way to make an impact now, right? To be there when it is happening and be on top of things through consulting and advising. Retaining close contact with your key stakeholders and clients, customers of internal audit is vital. Stay in touch with your key clients, not only the clients themselves, but also the other stakeholders, other assurance providers, audit committee, etc. Explore the new emerging risks. Ruslan already mentioned IT, internal control, business continuity, and incorporate them in your revised risk management strategies. That might be something to do later, but still keep an eye on it. Procurement was also mentioned by Ruslan as one of the key elements. We also selected that in the Netherlands as one of the key issues to look at, together with expenditure and subsidies. Be clear about what is allowed, and even more maybe what is not allowed when using IT tooling. So also there, the selection process, internal audit can have a critical look at the decision-making process of what to use and what not to use in these times of crisis. Last slide, please. Be agile in your planning, audit planning. Shift the priorities and the capacity when necessary, but always keep your stakeholders informed about what you are doing when you are going agile. So that is indeed, in terms of planning, an important issue. But as the previous speaker already mentioned, being agile in your auditing might be a good idea to also embrace after the crisis. At least that is also what we already tried to do in the Netherlands in our audit department, to work more agile and go with the environment instead of the other way around. Develop post-corona strategies. Mentioned already, I think already, about what can we learn from what is happening at the moment in the crisis, how we are responding to it, not only as internal audit, but also at the level of our clients. As CHU, be proactive. Ruslan used 2 times the wording internal audit is a bit lost in Ukraine. Well, I would say then that is a signal that CHU needs to show itself and support internal audit by guiding them through also this crisis and letting them know what has already been developed, because there's already so much out there. Look at the website of the IIA, for example, where a whole page is devoted to how internal audit could or should react to the crisis. Last but not least, update the financial management and control and internal audit training programs. We learn a lot in the crisis. Incorporate these new skills and techniques in what you are already do. And it might be also a good learning experience for the future and the further development of internal audit. So keep track of these learning issues and incorporate them. That is the last message. So this concludes our part.
Thank you, Manfred. Thanks, Ruslan, for quite an insight and practical sharing what's happening in our countries in response. So I understand it's quite widespread that internal audit is lost. At the same time, they are being proactive, and CAG needs to be, as well as internal audit, to be proactive. And of course, with keeping not taking over the responsibility at the same time, being involved in some processes, including procurement and others, cybersecurity and risks, just to be relevant. And then thanks a lot. And let's now move to the South African response. I would like to pass the floor to Nontando Myeza, who is Director in Internal Audit Support in National Treasury. And the National Treasury is in charge, this Chief Directorate is specifically responsible for supporting an establishment of effective internal audit and audit committees in the public sector in South Africa. Nontando also had quite extensive experience in various government organizations running internal audit function. Nontando, the floor is yours.
Like you said, Arman, thank you for the invitation. It's really a pleasure for us to be interacting and sharing our frustrations with you this time. I cannot say that it's a good experience or anything. It's really a frustration from our side, but nevertheless, we are pleased to share with you how we have dealt with this. On the 5th of March, South Africa find itself having the first case of coronavirus. And I must say that it was very tricky for us as South Africans, because majority of us has never heard of this coronavirus. And we find ourselves saying that we've got one case, which happened to be in KZN. In less than a month, we find ourselves with 274 cases. And that's when the government of South Africa announced that we're going to be having a lockdown, 21 days. And it started, and we thought, yes, it's going to be better. We're going to have we won't have a bigger of a problem. Because when you look at it, we said, where did it come from? So South Africa is very far from China, so we're not going to be that affected. But on the 27th, we find ourselves sitting with 1,170 cases and one death. And from there today, we are sitting with 3,158 cases. We are sitting with 54 deaths. On average, we've got 120 new cases. This really made it difficult for internal audits. And from that point, the government started to issue regulations. The regulations, the first one that were issued in March, 5th of March, was to say that we don't need people to be more than 100 in one space, relaxing some official hours and the number of people in the office. But by the 27th of March, it was clear that that wasn't helping, that wasn't working. And the government then decided that it's a total shutdown. It's a lockdown. Only essential services are going to be working. The rest of us, we needed to work from home or stay at home, depending on how you look at it. Can I have a next slide? Then there was a lack of adequate, some risk then emerged. When we were sitting as the team, we said, what is this that is happening? We had less than 3 working days to deal with this, to see how internal auditors are going to respond to this. And we had to ask ourselves some few questions. What are the emerging risks? Mind you, South Africa is decentralized. We don't have like a central internal audit. We've got more than, more than 1,000 internal audit shops when you look at it from the government perspective. When you look at the national department, provincial department, and local government, then it posed a very huge challenge from us. But let me start with the emerging risk. One of the emerging risks was that most of our institutions have business continuity. But as to whether it's adequate, I don't think so. We realized that it wasn't adequate because it didn't really touch on the pandemics. We looked at things in our business continuities. It was more about when we've got attacks, what are we going to do? When the information is lost, where is it stored? But it wasn't really looking at what will happen if everything happens in the country and all the geographical areas. What are we going to do? That was the first risk that we looked at. And the second one was the one that How then do we respond to this pandemic? But the major problem that we are faced with as the public sector is the non-adherence to procurement procedures. As like some of the speakers have mentioned, like a Department of Health and Social Development, looking at how are they going to acquire new tools at such notice that is required to make sure that the prevention and the limiting of the spread of the virus was one of the emerging risks. And the other one was looking from the internal audit now perspective. Do we have sufficient data mining tools? Do we have sufficient data analysis tools? As much as like a small pockets of internal audit shop has, but now then it says, do we have right skills to use those tools? And it was really one of the difficult things that we needed to reflect as internal audits. And we said, if we were to work from home, one of the biggest things that we are faced with is a lack of integrated financial management reporting. Because now, if we sit in an organization which has about 6 or 5 systems, how are we going to get the information with the IT being not as strong as we want it to be? That was another risk that we find ourselves in. One of the other risks that we find is that the internal audit now is going to start now becoming more of a management tool as opposed to being an independent, which will compromise its independence. Because now, as internal auditors, we need to be in the forefront. We need to work hand in hand with management to try and advise them on what needs to be done, what are the quick wins that a country can come up with. This is really a challenge because most of the time as internal auditors, we always say we need to be independent. We need to, when we come to the meetings, we need to sit there and say, oh, yes, here are the problems, then we advise, but making sure that those decisions are still left to management to take. But now we find ourselves when we are sitting in Skype, in audit teams, we need to say, this is wrong, and if they take it, it becomes a problem. Then it says, are we compromising ourselves as internal auditors? Those were the emerging risks that we picked up. But as time goes on, we can see that a lot are coming up that needs to be addressed as well. Then, as the team, we said, what do we need to do then? One of the things is that we need to advise management. As much as we have our risk management plans, risk management frameworks, but we realize that risk management doesn't really take into consideration issues of pandemic. Then we needed to start sensitizing them and making sure that they understand that as much as it's a virus, it also touches other areas like economic, the socio-economic activities of the country. So how then as a country we're going to respond? That was what we needed to do. We needed to update our internal audit plan. Now we needed to look at prioritizing. One of the factors that we find ourselves is that it was the end of the financial year for our government. How then is internal audit going to be available to give assurance on the financials that are going to be issued and what needs to be there? Then we needed to be more proactive in trying to say that how are they even going to develop or come up with those financial statements? And it became a little bit of a challenge depending on the location of different employees. How then are they going to, because we are used into sitting in the office and developing those financial statements, but now you find that the other one is at a different location. It really became a problem for us. But at the end of the day, we said we're a little bit lucky because of the things like Microsoft Teams. We made sure that by the time we had to leave the office on the 27th in the morning, every official had Microsoft Teams installed in their laptops. So in that case, at least we are able to communicate, to keep each other abreast of what is happening and try and see what can be done in this season. Then we decided that we're going to have scheduled times for the meetings for like face-to-face like we are doing now, when people need to give feedback, need to report on what internal auditors have been doing. But the other challenge that we find ourselves is that the audit software, as much as we've got some of our clients have teammates, Not all of them have the luxury of having audit software like Teammates, like ACL and all these things. Then as a country, we said we need to take stock and see how can we optimize the use of Excel in the interim. But now, as we say, that as much as we are communicating and trying to learn from the Excel that we find in the internet, it's not as easy as when we are sitting face to face and we have enough data to analyze. But that's what now the internal auditors are using. We're trying to optimize the use of Excel. And we said, even our internal audit staff, it's no longer about 8 to 4. We need to be flexible. We need to be available. Right now, I think we are sitting at the 5th or 6th regulation, the amendment to the regulation. Each and every time the regulation is amended, we need, like a government needs to have an insight, internal audit needs to pronounce on certain things, not to say that it's right, but to have the view and everything. So internal auditors, they needed to be more flexible than before. They needed to be available to give advice, not to say that I wasn't available, I couldn't give advice. The challenges that we are facing with now, it's a limited resources. As South Africa, we find ourselves that the connection to data, if we want people to be available for Skype, for Team, like Microsoft Team, it's becoming a problem. And over and above that, the cost of data is very high, and people, because we were not ready to make the 3Gs and everyone available to all the internal auditors, we pleaded with internal auditors to use their money to buy data and everything. So it's very costly. It becomes a challenge sometimes to access and find the internal auditors. Another thing that is becoming a challenge is that our systems are not integrated. When you want information, you have to contact more than one person because the information is sitting at different packets and different people have different information that is useful or that is relevant for the internal audits that the people are doing, internal auditors are doing. That's the biggest challenge that we think that going forward, we need to look and speed up the financial management system that is going to be integrated. And one of the other biggest is to obtain evidence, looking at the projects that other people are still working on, extracting and getting evidence. It requires one to go to a different location. And that case, since we are on lockdown, we cannot do that. And now it says, how then do we make sure that we have access to that information going forward? It is really becoming a challenge for us, but we're hoping that when this is uplifted, it's one of the things that we're going to work on. And like I said before, the issue of integrated reporting is now coming back to say that how are we going to optimize it going forward? As South African, how are we going to use all the relevant available resources to us to make sure that we optimize the reporting, we minimize the decentralization of information and try and find it and make sure that it's centralized at some point where we can all access it when need be. Then my last points are like the opportunities that the coronavirus have posed is that we need to be advising management on knowledge management tools. We need to make sure that there is knowledge management in each and every organization, and everybody needs to understand where information is and who is responsible for information, not to be caught off guard or not to be found wanting when you need to do an audit. We need to make sure that it's clear what information and who has what information in an organization in the public sector. We need to invest more on internal audit software and information expertise. As much as we've got softwares and we've got internal auditors, but sometimes we don't have the right expertise. So we find ourselves that as much as we've got all this information, but within our team as internal audits, we don't have the IT experts. So going forward, it tells us as internal auditors of South Africa that we need to increase the number of IT auditors within our teams. We are sitting at less than 5% of IT auditors. We need to increase that so that we become relevant and make sure that we add value into our organization. We need to as internal auditors now, we need to look at being innovative. It's one of the very important things, but we've been talking about maybe now it's the time that we speed up, we stop talking about it and start implementing, because if we were at the level that we would have we love to be, we wouldn't be having so much problem as internal auditors. So we need to be innovative so that when our clients, because of our geographical area, we are able to work and get information regardless of where the person is. That's one of our problems, opportunities that we see. Then we need to diversify the team. Right now, when we're looking at the Department of Health, as much as it's got financial experts and other experts, but we don't have a lot of medical experts. So as internal auditors, we need to advise on the programs that are put in place, on the vaccine that are being tried, on all these things. But from the internal audit point of view, how much can we advise? We don't have that much to say on the technicality of the work that is posed by the coronavirus. Then it gives us an opportunity to say that we need to diversify our team as internal auditors and look into tapping into the specialized services within all the spheres of government. And then we need to optimize the use of the continuous auditing. I think now when we look at our plan, when things go back to the new normal, because it's not going to be normal, to the new normal, we need to say, what is continuous auditing? How then do we optimize that, as opposed to come and do a little bit and go and come back after 2 months or a year? We need to make sure that as internal audits, when we identify our risk, we also identify the areas where continuous auditing can be done, and we optimize that and make sure that we report continuously on certain areas of risk within the organization. But the more and more, it goes back to the combined assurance. It says as organization, we can no longer work by saying that I'm an external auditor, I'm a risk and in silo mentality. We need to optimize the combined assurance and make sure that we give a holistic view to management on how the assurance is given. And if we were to optimize that, and going forward, we will see a better and efficient internal audit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nontando. Very interesting, because the challenges you have shared and many internal auditors face, but also opportunities, as you referred, knowledge management, IT software, internal audit, IT software, IT expertise in the team, being innovative, diversified team, including, for example, as you say, medical expert doctors who can provide value to the client. Continuing auditing as a new, continuous auditing in the new normal, how it's going to work, and combined audit and the combined assurance model with supreme audit institution as a one. That were quite interesting insights. Thanks a lot. And finally, let's hear now from Nathan Paget, who is the Group Chief Internal Auditor from the Government of Internal Audit Agency of the United Kingdom. It's a centralized internal audit agency who leads the delivery of internal audit services in DEFRA into more than 17 different government organizations. Nathan has over 20 years of internal audit experience and has been very actively engaged with IACOP for many years. We know how United Kingdom, same as the Netherlands, are hit severely by the coronavirus. Let's hear the insights from Nathan.
Cheers, Arman. And thank you, everybody. And thank you to the colleagues who've gone before, because to some extent, they've made my job a lot easier. I'll cut down some of the presentation because I am covering some of the same ground. I suppose to start off firstly, if there are any positives from the whole UK issue around Brexit, one of them is probably that when it came to COVID-19, many of the scenarios that we worked through for Brexit were immediately applicable to the COVID-19 response. However, the global scale of that was something that we didn't have in terms of our imagination considerations that James referred to, something that we'd really given much thought to. So in terms of my role as a Group Chief Internal Auditor, I've been working within central government within the UK to consider what the internal audit response should be in this time of extreme crisis. And I think that there are 4 ways that I'll talk to today, and a 5th way, something that I would touch on in terms of how we've closed down the audit work from last year in terms of 1920, is that we took an immediate position identifying those audits that we could conclude and can complete remotely, and we've concluded them. So we've stopped the audits where the field work was in flight. We've concluded the audits through to final report where they were in draft report stage, and we are consolidating that work into a year-end opinion to support the annual report and accounts within the UK. That said, the UK timetable now for laying our accounts reports to Parliament has obviously been pushed back as a result of the crisis, and we're now looking to September 2020 when the accounts for the department will be laid. I think some of the things I would touch on very briefly at the top of the presentation. We've taken a 4-point approach to the way in which we've engaged with our customers. Immediately, we were asked to embed within the teams in much the same way as Manfred outlined in the crisis response. But we've also been embedding within the wider business as usual response, and I'll touch on that later within the presentation. The other area that we've been quite heavily involved in is seconding people out of internal audit to work in the frontline business, mainly because we have had significant numbers of people contract the illness, and that's had an impact on the ability to respond to government initiatives and policies in terms of moving the economy forward. So we've had to take the conscious decision for some of our people to step outside of an audit role to move into frontline business. And of course, the issue of conflicts of interest then arise, but that's in the future. For now, the immediate response is to try and work through the crisis, and that has been part of our crisis response. The third thing is that I think we've touched on a lot of remote auditing activity. The good thing is that we were fairly geared up as an audit function for remote working. I have many guys who are not office-based, who are home-based, but also the nature of the audit work, given that we cover agriculture and fisheries, means that you're not always in an office. You're out and about, you're on farm, you're at harbours, you can be anywhere. So we're quite used to that remote way of working. The final thing I would say is that with our internal audit plans, for the next year, the current year, we've done away with agreeing an annual plan for the year. What we are doing is planning on a quarter-by-quarter basis. So for Q1, we've just agreed our work programme, which is a combination of the measures I've just gone through, and we will do the same for Q2 and Q3 if the crisis continues. Once we get past the crisis, and then we move into a pattern of what might be seen as normal ways of working, we will look to then move back into an annual plan cycle again. But until the uncertainty that surrounds COVID-19 and the move back to a business as usual cycle is fully understood, we've taken the view that stepping back from a standard audit cycle is the right thing to do. And that's right across government within the UK. Thank you. So really just to make the point of some of the things that have been gone through earlier, we've supported COVID responses in the UK by supporting the immediate crisis management response. So that's been around establishing ourselves within the work streams, being clear on what our role has been within those work streams and continues to be, and then work through with our knowledge and experience the scenario planning that is then taking place within the UK, including the planning response. I'll just briefly go through the next few slides to give you the heading, and then further down I'll go into the detail. But one of the things I did want to touch on, and we've not covered a lot of so far, is the workforce risk or the people risk. And I think there's been a kind of need for us to think about this differently, and I'll explain some of the opportunities and the ways in which we've done that within the UK. The next one is operation and supply chain risk. And again, we've had to develop rapid communications plans for getting out to our customers, to tell them what our response is, to make clear to them what the support is that they can expect from government, but also to make clear to them what the enduring business as usual activities are. COVID-19 hasn't really had an impact on animals in the same way as various other strains had before. So things like animal welfare and the need for animals to move through slaughterhouses and the storage of animals and food to keep the supply chain going have been key considerations. So the communications with our customers, the users of our services, has been extremely important. I think we've touched on the focus on data, so I don't want to labour that too much. But just to relate it back to the points that James made earlier, in terms of our imagination, we're very well geared up within the UK for doing data analysis and for data extraction and data mining. The big impact of COVID-19 in the UK is that most of our data is housed and dealt with through India. So the fact that India closed down meant that we couldn't get access to our data. So although we had all the procedures in place, we couldn't actually get to the data itself to run the various analysis of reports that you might want to do. On customers, we've had to prioritise what we do in relation to our customers, and in prioritisation, we've had to really make clear to them the things that we're stopping doing. And that's been quite difficult to get that message across, going back to the communications. And then in corporate services sense, just how we've worked with our corporate services to not only support our response, but to support our people and our teams that we've got working out remotely across the UK at the moment. So I just want to touch on in detail now some of those areas in relation to further considerations. And what I would say is that what I'm going to touch on in here in this section is not just the impacts on the service we deliver, but the impacts I've been experiencing in relation to me and my team and how I've had to manage them through the process. So I'll touch on each one of them specifically as we go through the next few slides. So the first one that I've touched on, and I don't think we've covered really enough today, is around people. And in a sense, the team that I manage, we've always worked remotely. That's never been the issue. Connecting remotely wasn't the issue. The reality was that when we locked down, you lose that human contact, that interaction. So what we've done is put lots of things in place to encourage that interaction to still continue, albeit virtually. So we'll sit down once a week and we'll have a coffee afternoon. We'll still have a team meeting and we'll do quizzes. We'll learn a bit more about people and they'll give an introduction of themselves, and we'll get to know people in a more specific way, but virtually rather than face to face. What I've also noticed, and it's a key thing within an organisation and within your internal audit teams, that this is the time that leaders need to be leaders. You need to make more contact with your people, whether that be on Skype, on the phone, or whatever medium you choose to have. It's the important thing is the leadership of your people now in this time of crisis is critical. What we're noticing in the UK is 4 or 5 weeks into lockdown, almost initially, in terms of this being a good thing, people's feelings and emotions are quite high. And then as the lockdown carries on, their emotions dip. And people become a bit disillusioned with everything that's going on or not going on. And part and parcel of our role as leaders is to acknowledge that, to deal with it, and to try and proactively work through it. So one of the strategies that we've employed in a work sense is by having a plan and a pipeline of work that we can place all our people onto, so that everybody is occupied for the majority of their time. That said, one of the key things we've realised is that with the schools being closed, we're not classed as key workers. The impact on our teams in terms of children being at home as well has had a significant impact on the hours and the work and the time that people can put in. And rather than asking them to look after the children for a full day and at the same time try and do a full day's work, we've implemented a simple policy whereby we just ask them to do as much as they can do each day. We define the task that we need them to do, and we give them a reasonably open window in which to complete the task so that they can strike that work-life balance. You can have all the policies and procedures that you want, but the reality of trying to deal with this crisis, the biggest impact is on people. And of course, we've had people go down with the illness, significant numbers. We've also, in the last week, had somebody within the agency that passed away from the virus. So the situation is quite real. But the important thing from my perspective is the leadership that we give our people. And then we make sure that the leaders within the organisations we service support their people in the same way. In terms of operations, I think all I would touch on there is really, we covered a lot of this in terms of business continuity plans. Yes, they were in place. Did they foresee a scenario of this scale or nature? No, they didn't. But now that they're there, now that this crisis is upon us, we're having to prioritise ruthlessly as a business, but also in relation to the work that we do. And we are trying to form relationships in terms of how we work across government departments. So the need to prioritise your activities as an internal audit function aligned to risk is crucial. And the areas on this slide and the next few are the ones where I've worked with DEFRA on refreshing their own risk register to focus on these key areas. One that we've touched on briefly, but not too much, is around commercial. Clearly, the economic impacts of COVID-19 will, in the future, we will understand the scale of them. The important thing for now is that we need to keep the economy going. And one of the ways that we're doing this in a DEFRA context and across government is making certain that we are paying our suppliers promptly. And we have procedures in place that allow for us to do that on an ongoing basis. Clearly, we need to understand where suppliers are in relation to their response, but we are dealing with them in a way that allows their cash flow to still operate in a sustainable way. And that's really important in terms of what comes next in the future. Clearly, within all of this, we are maintaining sound financial control. Within the UK, we have a publication called Managing Public Money, and that is very prescriptive around the procedures and the rules in which we use public money and the basis on which we account for public money. But it's fair to say that in response to the crisis, we have been working to ease some of those controls to increase our risk tolerance in certain areas around how we use cash. Yes, that does mean that we are likely to experience more fraud and more error. But what we're doing is constantly monitoring that information against our indicators of fraud risk to just identify where we're seeing unusual patterns of activity or things not working in the way that we would expect them to in the scenarios that we've outlined. I think we've touched on the technology and security. As I say, we're already geared up for working from home. The people dimension of that, I think, has been our bigger focus rather than the reality of bandwidth and things of that nature. I think that in truth, the procedures, whether you're working at home or in the office, are exactly the same. The vulnerabilities are that clearly you're working on a home network rather than a secure office network. But the guidance there and the information points and the procedures that we should follow are still the same and haven't been changed. It's just that obviously you have to be flexible in terms of what works for you. Sometimes it might be, today it's Kudo, other times it's Zoom, Skype, Microsoft Teams, and then old-fashioned ways it might just be the telephone. So the flexibility of how we are using technology and the principles, we just roll forward our policies. As I say, we were already geared up for home working, but it is important that these elements of technology and security are taken into account. So this is my final slide, and all I wanted to capture on this was just in one page what we as the Government Internal Audit Agency are doing in relation to the 1920 plan and the opinion, and then the plans for 2021 and how we're responding to immediate customer requests. I'd like to close by saying that actually, I know that COVID-19 is a massive, massive thing. And I wish you all and your families well, and I hope you're staying safe. But I think that there's an element of this where we've got to look at the opportunities that this remote way of working has brought about, albeit in an enforced kind of way. But I actually think that there are some smarter ways of working that we are generating in response to this crisis. And I'm sure that you will have seen the reports in the paper that show that with people traveling less, there's a positive in terms of sustainability and climate change. In a financial sense, the cost of estates in London is massive. But if we didn't need as much of an estate presence because we can work from home in a more ongoing way going forward, then that will have a financial saving, as well as a personal financial saving, because it costs a lot to travel into London, so it works both ways. And then the other one I think that I've touched on is the well-being. I think when you get past this enforced isolation, actually commuting less, having to travel less, but being able to work more and to work more flexibly the hours that you do will have a massive well-being positive impact as well. So I do think that, there are some things that we've learned through this crisis that we should bank and use in the future. So apologies, that was a quick run through of my slides, but that's the response in the UK, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Nathan, for a very interesting presentation, and also going beyond just internal audit profession and sharing the people perspective and the leader perspective, as well as just working more. It means also massive well-being for all of us. Pass the floor to Jean-Pierre for commentary of the benefits and drawback of the evolving role of internal auditor before questions. Many participants know Jean-Pierre. He's a World Bank our team member of IACOP, and he's also the Audit Progress Committee member of the European Commission, chairman of Audit Committee of Local Governments in Flanders in Belgium, also CEO of the IA Belgium, a professional with more than 44 years experience of internal audit as an internal audit practitioner and trainer. Jean-Pierre, the floor is yours.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Arman, and also thanks to the previous speakers. I believe we heard a lot of useful information. Arman, you mentioned 44 years of experience, but it is the first time in my life that I experienced a situation like this. So nowadays, I do have to deal with internal audit departments. I had in full Corona period a quality assessment review of a major organization in Germany. I have to deal with the transformation of training from regular in-person or in-class trainings to e-seminars and e-assisted learning. And then finally, I have to deal with audit committees that are also now meeting now in a virtual format with sometimes a total different agenda. So what I would like to take you through very shortly, in fact, are some practical tips from chief audit executives. Next slide, please. Within the Institute of Internal Auditors in Belgium, but also in the Netherlands, we have regular meetings of the heads of internal audit. And of course, the very first topic for this spring period was indeed COVID-19. But out of that, a lot of surveys resulted, and also some common points of views or some issues that chief audit executives were dealing with. So we take it for granted, but it's not always sure that every single auditor has a personal laptop, a laptop that he or she can carry home with. In the past, we counted on auditors working sometimes from their home computer. Now the home computer became a family computer. You have the children at home, and these children also have to attend classes. So everybody is working on the same computer while you have to do your job, and you even have some confidential information that you would have to take care of. Nathan also emphasized that remote communication with your team members. This is really needed because I can also see that people they stay at home. And I'm in my 6th week right now, but everybody experiences this in a total different way. You have people like me. I'm all alone in a house. I didn't go outside for 6 weeks, just in the garden. I didn't meet a human being except on the phone or on the Skype or on the Zoom or on the Skype for Business, etc. But you have others, in fact, who live in a small place with 2 or 3 children around, everybody at home, which is also a very stressful situation. So with my staff, I meet like twice a week. We have a 1-hour meeting. We have many others in between on a one-to-one basis, but at least 1 hour that we dedicate to ourselves. And that's you can see on their faces that they regret it when that 1 hour is over and they have to get back to their work without the presence of their colleagues. If you work from home, also it's time also to rethink about your access. Your access, especially to the common shared files that you have, where you need to have a VPN access and so on. We heard it also from Manfred, be involved in the crisis management calls and in the teams there as well. This is very often easier said than done. If you were never asked to attend a crisis management meeting, and this was always, in fact, in the pre-mode, where nothing was going on, the chances are less likely that you will be invited nowadays. But still try to do this as an observer. We talk about the business continuity plans, and for sure, this will be an audit topic for many audit functions in the near future. But let's not forget our own business continuity plan. I still do not know too many internal audit functions who have a business continuity plan for themselves. So we are usually preaching, in fact, what should be in place, but sometimes we also forget to look at ourselves. And the same is, in fact, valid when we used to talk about taking regular backups, etc. Now, the impact on the audit plan. And I know that for many internal audit functions, the achievement of the audit plan, it has become like a key performance indicator. So let's try to stick to that. But we should not forget that the audit plan that we are currently working on, that audit plan has been established based on an ongoing business of our organization. Now, our organization is not in an ongoing business mode anymore. Many of our organizations are in a survival mode. So that means that we really have to adopt our plan as well and to revisit priorities. I believe that the audit functions that at the end of 2020 can say, I achieved my audit plan, it is a proof that you may not have been that agile as you should have been. And so let's think about this as well. So performing our ongoing audits remotely if possible, yes, but we should be prepared also to postpone even ongoing audits in areas that are in stress mode. We have to be flexible there. We have proven that in the past as well. If we were scheduled in the month of February to start an audit in the accounting area, sometimes they ask us, yes, we are so busy now because we have really to close the end-year accounts, etc. And we show our flexibility by saying, okay, we will postpone our audits for a couple of months. And so especially for these areas, we have to look at that. The same is valid for looking at the corrective actions and the follow-up on audit recommendations. Let's not stress them. All the people in the organizations, their priorities have also been shuffled. That doesn't mean that the corrective actions are not a priority, but here again, take a risk-based approach. And you should also consider whether the recommendations that you have made some time ago, whether they are still valid in these very circumstances. And so let's have a new look at that. Then try to be careful as well with the unsatisfactory statements in your report, especially in key areas. We know that now people are very often working in a way that it may not be in full accordance with the books and with the procedures. And of course, there is a clear difference between what can be allowed and what cannot be allowed. But there is a big gray zone in between. And let's take into consideration as well that people are also doing their best in order to not only meet their objectives, but to keep their customers or to keep the citizens satisfied as well. What we have seen is that, but it depends on the business, that some auditors, in fact, were asked to stop doing their audit business. And this was the case mainly in the healthcare sector. In the hospitals, senior management has said to the auditors, please stay at home, don't bother us, we have different things to do, we don't have time for you. So, of course, it is also a clear indication about what in the past the value of internal audit meant to them. But it's time also to reconsider this situation and to think about how can we, in fact, build up that trust and that support to the business again. Now that almost everybody is working out of home, of course, the risk of cyber attacks and the IT security as a whole, they become on the forefront as well. You remember that when we met in Sochi some months ago, that I showed you the study made by the European Institutes of Internal Auditing on the risk in focus. And of course, the number one risk was cybersecurity risk. Pandemic risk, in fact, was nowhere to see. Now, for those of you who remember about 15 years ago, when SARS and the little sister of Corona emerged in Southeast Asia, I remember many internal audit functions, in fact, who highlighted that risk towards their management. And they were smiled away, yes, that's a hypothetical risk for the future. Now, we have to be careful nowadays, especially also with the business continuity plan. We know, everybody knows in the organization that many of the business continuity plans do not work as they were intended to work, or they were not perfect, they were not complete enough. Now, let's not immediately hit them again by saying, this was not okay, or you remember, I told you that, you didn't listen to me. No, let's not open doors that are already open. Let's more focus, in fact, on how we can help the business to implement recommendations, not only the recommendations that we identified, but the recommendations that will become more visible in the lessons learned periods after the Corona periods. I know that many of the previous speakers, they also highlighted these innovative approaches, which I encourage to do so. but also we need more IT. Yes, we need more ITs, but right now we have to be also aware that we will not have a priority with the IT function. There will be other priorities that they will have to deal with, and internal audit for their tools, etc., will not have that first or second or third priority. So we have to be creative with the tools that we have, like Excel and others, to do that. With regard to the reports, and I refer back to the slides and the presentation of James in the very beginning, we have to report in a different way. Short reports, it's just like the headlines in a newspaper that are helpful towards management. And if we don't change the shape and the format of our reports, we know that management may not have given that top priority to our reports in the past. When they had the time, yes, they went through that, or when it was an agenda item on a meeting, they will have gone through that. But nowadays, you will not get more attention if you stick to the same format as in the past. So we need to change that. I received a question last week from a major internal audit function, and they say, yes, when we do an audit, we first look at the design of the controls that are in place. And if the design looks well, we do the testing. Nowadays, and the design looks well, we do the testing that proves, in fact, how these controls have been implemented. Nowadays, we can usually look at the design because we can do remote interviews. We have remote access to the procedures, etc. So that part we can do, but we cannot properly do the testing. So would it be okay, in fact, that we still provide our reasonable assurance as usual and put a disclaimer in the report that we have not been able to properly do the testing? This is not acceptable. You cannot provide your assurance by just putting a disclaimer. It would be the same as if you go to the doctor and he says, I cannot do the testing, but I can confirm you that you are okay. No, this is a limitation of your scope. What you can do in this case is to provide limited assurance on the design of the controls only, and that is already helpful. And then, in fact, the testing and the rest you can do eventually at a later stage. So you may go for a limited assurance in this case. And this was also already highlighted by Nathan when he talked about the global opinion at the end of the year, which will also be seriously limited. Now, if we look at the role of the CHU, because many of the participants today are member of the CHU, I believe it is the right moment here to show your support to the heads of internal audit. When I mentioned, in fact, my weekly meetings, virtual meetings with my people, this is in fact what you can do with the various heads of internal audit. Don't forget that some of them are very lonesome. They are alone in their function or with 2 or 3. So this is the moment, in fact, that they need your support, but also by being in a virtual room with the other heads of internal audit, that will certainly motivate them. So pay less attention maybe to the reports that they have to submit to the CHU, to the quality reviews that you do with them, but try to help them to move forward. Then, just as an illustration before I finish, this is a survey that was launched in the Netherlands and in Belgium, both at the heads of internal audits, and a few questions were really asked about what is the focus of internal audits nowadays. Have you been asked by management to do something else, etc.? So now the survey was done 3 weeks ago. I'm pretty sure that the results would be a little bit different now. Maybe not in general for both countries, but as I said, when you look at specific sectors as well. Those who in fact are more, let's say, happy with the way that things are still going because they found solutions are the public sector and the finance sector, but not that much the other ones. And the reason for finance and public sector to be a little bit better comfortable is because they are the regulated ones. So internal audit is regulated in these cases. If you work in a pharmaceutical industry or in healthcare, you are not regulated. But that's where indeed the real value of internal audit as it is being perceived in the organization comes up. So these were the few words that I wanted to share with you. I hope that this was all useful for you, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you. Back to Arman.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pierre. All the presentations were very useful, and your sharing the tips and the CAG focus on the CAG world was very important. And it's so hard to cut shorter the presentation. So we'll now moving to the question session. Give a question to James, Nontando, and Nathan. Actually, Manfred and Jean-Pierre referred for the internal audit to move to the first and second line of defense. I understand, for example, being a member of the ad hoc procurement committees with or without some responsibilities for example, for integrity reasons, developing the streamlined operations and HR policies and procedures which are currently developed for many, assessing the design and designing the business continuity planning. So shall auditors take this type of role, and how further they can go today? James, would like to go first, and then Nontando and Nathan.
My general message would be, this is a time to be pragmatic and show the skills and value that you can give. And I am sure, as Jean-Pierre said, you may have to put limitations on what you're doing so you don't mislead people, so they don't take things the wrong way. But I think it'd be far better to be helpful and then explain the limitations than hide behind the standards and then have people saying the fire was blazing and you didn't help us put the fire out. So that would be my overall recommendation to people, and then to think about how to protect and to clarify to make sure that internal audit is not misused. But most heads of audit are smart enough to make sure they're not going to be misused.
I would agree completely with the points James has raised. And to an extent, I think in the scenario we find ourselves now in DEFRA, we're doing that same thing. So, you know, we've been asked to sit down with the finance teams and review their end-to-end process and look at how the controls within the process can be streamlined. So we are doing some of that now in the finance and the commercial sense. So I would echo the point that James made, is that I think as an internal audit service, we've got to remain relevant. And we won't be seen as relevant if at this moment in time we stick to our principles of this is what we do as internal audit. I think being flexible, being nimble and being responsive are the things that I know in DEFRA people are asking of me and my team now. And we have to respond to those to be seen as an internal service. And I think, to echo again the point James made earlier, it's a great opportunity to showcase the skills that you have within your internal audit teams.
Thank you, Nathan. Nontando?
Thank you. I will agree with the colleagues to say that we need to be relevant and we need to make sure that we provide advice. Over and above that, we need to be cautious though, as internal auditors. We need to know our limitations and our capabilities, because it will be pointless for us to try and play hero, and we are at the end of the day, it's at the detriment of the organization. Like I said before, if in an internal audit we're dealing with right now the crisis is in the health sector, do we have expertise? Are we the right people to advise on certain issues? It's rather we say we are unable to advise than to try and play hero and advise and find out that we are advising on the wrong things where we are not experts. That's all I can say.
Next question, I received question is to Manfred, Ruslan and Jean-Pierre. What is the likely impact on internal controls of the need to act quickly in the interest of the nation? Should internal audit help by providing more ex-post assurance on the effectiveness of expenditure in high-risk areas?
Yes, in fact, while you were talking, I was thinking about the basic definition of internal control. And one of the items that was implied was internal control is only a means to achieve something. It's not a goal in itself. So that means that we and the organization should also be flexible with regard to the components of the internal control system. And we have to make a clear distinction between, let's say, immediate actions that are taking place right now and the future. For the future, we may not accept compromises, but for the emergency, we may accept compromises.
Yeah.
If a doctor, a medic has to, I like always to make the comparison with the medical world as an internal auditor, because we are the doctor for the internal control system. So if a doctor cannot apply the hygienic condition to save somebody's life, what is the priority? To respect the procedure or to save the life?
Yeah, I agree, because in the same situation in the Netherlands with this economic support package, you can, as internal audit function, sit on that with your natural, let's say, compliance look and make sure that every dime or every coin is spent accordingly, or you can be a little bit more flexible in this time of crisis, where companies are, let's say, in deep economic crisis, and are in survival mode. So that delicate balance between not being over, let's say, over controlling the control system, so to say, from an internal auditor's point of view, I think that is the balance that we are still looking for. Like how far do you go in your old role as internal audit, or are you a little bit more flexible, as you say, Jean-Pierre? I agree. Yeah.
Actually, I would like also to add that when I mentioned about few ad hoc audits, which was kind of requested by the management, that was mostly ex-post so-called audit. And actually, this is also kind of window of opportunity for internal auditors to show that they can be helpful for the management as well. So, of course, they should not move it into the daily practice, but I fully agree with you that they can and have to use it, but they also have to follow their professionality in a way, and not cross the borderline to some extent, but still react for the management request in a way they can be helpful. So I would, on my side, support this issue and say yes.
So I believe, Ruslana, the key word that you say there is, how can I help you as an internal auditor, rather than how can I check on you?
From Zondre, how can internal audit play a role to ensure that the best agile procurement processes are followed under stringent timelines? Example, standardized one-pager emergency procurement template for all public institutions.
Just to say that, as has been highlighted, what I think we're really good at is emphasizing the consequences and the risks that happen from certain decisions. And our role is to advise, and ultimately for management to take the accountability. We don't say something's okay. We say, if you make this choice, these are the implications. So if you take more agile procurement activities where perhaps tendering is not happening in the same way, for certain transactions of a certain size, or certain checks are not taking place, the importance of the size of the transaction, the nature of the transaction, and the consequences. I think this is where our role comes in. For a certain class of transactions, you can do this much quicker, but there will be these risk consequences which somebody needs to own. And so you can imagine different speeds depending on the amount of risk and the amount of money. And I think this is where we shouldn't be saying, let's just make very large payments in an agile way. This should be flexible between size and risk and the amount of control that we want management to decide to take.
Very good. Thanks, James. Anybody else? So our advice is just be active, engaged, because this is one pager, simplified. Provide advice, but don't take responsibility. Just give an advice on the process and be involved. How can internal audit? It's about force majeure. How can internal audit influence and add value in how the government regulate, provide guidance on the public, triggering the force majeure clauses to avoid the rippling effect for organizations which could cause damage to the economy? So is there a role for the internal auditors? Interesting question.
Yes, I'm not sure whether I fully understood the question. It's when the public is using the force majeure principle for escaping from the responsibility, duties, etc.
Yes, exactly. And is there can internal auditor has there play a role for the internal auditor on advising the government organizations which apply this force majeure, whether it is correctly applied or by contractors, and how this process is whether it's properly managed?
Yeah. You see, setting up the rules for an interpretation of force majeure is not our role, because this is guidance, in fact, or rules that have to be established by the government. But at least we can be part of the discussion and trigger, in fact, the members of the government to think about, and what about this, and what about that, so that they are better prepared when they are issuing guidelines and when they are closing, in fact, the doors of the escape routes there as well.
Few questions. What about the quality of the remote audits? I hope that we won't get the same quality as we have before. And also about the security of the information, because now with remote audits, the auditors will exchange a lot of documents and information. And what about the IT security of that? And do you have some suggestion? And one day when all this finish, how the auditors would add a value to the institutions to solve the problems after virus crisis? Thank you.
Please, this will be our last question because of the time management. Please share all your questions within 1 hour next.
I'm pretty reluctant, in fact, to compromise on the quality of the audits, although they are being done in a different way. But we cannot provide the same kind of assurance, the same kind of opinion or conclusion with a less quality. We can go for limited assurance, which is not as complete as the reasonable assurance that we would normally give. But you have to make sure that you have done everything you could have done to perform the audit in a qualitative way. If you cannot, then I would suggest postpone that kind of audit, but don't do it right now.
Thanks, Jean-Pierre. Nathan, and then James.
I just echo the points that Jean-Pierre's just made. The quality of remote audits is not compromised. What you may do is change your approach to an audit. So there are various European programs that we still cover within the UK that are partly around validating the paper trail and then partly around physically going and inspecting the farm or the fishery. So what we're doing in this time of crisis is doing the paper trail, because we can do that remotely, and testing that so that when things are lifted and we can go out and visit again, later in the program cycle, we'll go out and do the inspections. So we're not compromising the quality, we're just flexing the approach that we are using to suit the circumstances. And we're doing that for two reasons. One, to accommodate a response to the business, but two, as I mentioned earlier, this thing about the well-being of your team members. To give the guys something to do, we've had to think a bit more in a creative way, but the one thing that we're not doing is undermining the quality. And to just briefly touch on the security aspects, when it comes to sharing documentation, there are various packages out there that we use quite successfully for particularly low sensitive kind of documentation. One that we use for doing our audits in this way is called Huddle. There'll be others out there that you can use, and there are also the systems that you will have within your respective agencies that may allow you to exchange documentation en masse in a secure way, such as SharePoint, which might be on a network drive for you, and things of that nature. So there are still ways to do the business without compromising on the security. Thank you, Arman.
James?
Just very quickly, I think it becomes so much more important on the assurance to be really focused on your scope. And then on the security point, I completely agree. I think we need to be a role model when it comes to protecting documents, even if it's as basic as putting a password protection on a Microsoft document, and reminding, if I received something last week and I had to remind somebody offline, you should have protected this. You sent it to me. And I think it's really important to check what communication has gone around, not just for audit, but other areas, who's password protecting, because that's exactly the kind of area that could be forgotten and then cause a problem, not just for an audit department, but for a government department or whatever.
I think on the issue of the quality of the remote audits, I think they've said enough to say that what can we do? But more importantly, in order for us not to compromise on the quality, we need to redefine our objectives for the audits. I think Jani, like before, he spoke about the adequacy. If we cannot do an effectiveness of certain controls, it needs to be clear when we define our objectives that we're going to be looking at the adequacy of the controls, but we won't be able to do the effectiveness. Then by doing that, we're making sure that the quality, when we look at the adequacy, it's certain we can give quality work. However, we cannot give quality work when you look at the effectiveness. Then when we define our objectives and our scope, it needs to be clear when we do that. And in the issue of security information, like the gentleman said, that we must make sure that we've got all those security features. If you request information, like sharing information, it needs to be clear from who can you only request that information and who is responsible to give that information. If information needs to be PDF before it's sent so that it cannot be interrupted or corrupted, then we need to make sure those are the simplest things that can be done to ensure that the information we're moving is still secure. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you very much. Thank you for very detailed and very relevant reflections on the question. A very good question, Tatiana. Thanks. I would like just to thank all our speakers and question participants, and I would like to pass the floor to Lerka, who is just on the screen, who is Executive Committee, PEMPAL IACOP Executive Committee member, and also the co-lead of Audit in Practice, our working group, and represents Ministry of Finance of Croatia for closing remarks. Lerka, the floor is yours.
Hello to everyone. The conferencing is approaching to its end. PEMPAL has internal audit community of practice has once again gathered its members together to discuss how to address our similar challenges. We had quite an interesting insights on how to provide effective internal audit and to be useful to our organizations and the management during COVID-19 pandemic. We have learned the specific actions taken by several countries on the current situation to make our role of internal audit relevant. That would clearly inform and help to revisit our risk management, our activities and tools to provide much valuable support in this crisis. As we see, in all the countries, the situation is almost the same. New risks emerged and hit both the private and the public sector. The government responded to it, and there are changes in budgets, flexibility on fiscal risks, management and processes, etc. Consequently, the pandemic has an impact on the work of internal audit too. Nobody was prepared for this pandemic. Internal audit should adapt to the new situation. proactively engaged and consider suitable options. The heads of the internal audit units are responsible for ensuring safety, non-personal interactions, and effective remote working that is closely connected with the cybersecurity risks and many organizational technical challenges and skills, knowledge, and expertise. Internal audit should analyze the impact of the audit plans and adjust the plans to respond to the new situation and take into account the current priorities. In those circumstances, the advisory role of internal audit is enhanced. Internal auditors should be involved in crisis management calls. Communication on all levels is extremely important. We as internal auditors should more focus on the recent standards that are talking about insight and foresight. We should ensure providing these services now, sometimes temporarily engaging in the role of the first and the second line of defense is needed. We should adapt right now to escape bigger problems later, when all this is over and managers will ask where we were. Internal audit should also think about the new plans, how to work after the crisis, and prepare internal audit business continuity plans, and be aware of the new normal. CHU should support internal audit in these activities. I would like to thank the presenters for their time and efforts to provide us with their insights. Thank you all, dear colleagues, for your participation and discussion in this event. I would also like to thank our interpreters and support team for their dedicated and professional translation and support as we were running through this CUDA platform for the first time. PEMPAL Internal Audit Community of Practice plan to continue with organizing smart interactive talks. Another is planned to be on June the 2nd. The topic of the next event will be key performance indicators on internal audit effectiveness. We hope that you will be able to join us. Taking into account our future activities, I will end this event with the saying of Winston Churchill. This is not the end. This is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning.